No worries. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's been really interesting listening to the presentations because Jonathan talked about keeping the money, which stole my thunder, and then Kai talked about economic base, which is also something that I want to talk about. I teach regional economics, and I'm trained in regional economics. And one of the very first things I do in my classes is I tell my students that they're not allowed to use the word diversification. And we're in a crowd of innovators and entrepreneurs, and I'm sure that that shocks you a little bit. One of the reasons I say that is because since I came to Alaska in 2012, every time I've gone to a presentation, the person essentially would come up and say, you know what? Alaska needs to become more diversified. Well, great advice, thank you. Oh, if only it were that easy, right? So what I want to talk to you about is import substitution. I don't see my presentation here. No worries. And I want to talk about import substitution because it's not sexy, but it's necessary. And it's the only way isolated economies, small economies, developing economies grow. We've abandoned it. It's something that people don't want to talk about because most people associate it with tariffs, with subsidies, with protectionism, which we've left behind. But it's impossible for small economies, and no small economies have grown without at least looking very closely at the amount of money that they keep and how they can keep more of it. Yes, it's great to export goods. Yes, it's necessary to export goods. Yes, economic bases are absolutely fundamental. But unless you have a way of structurally changing the economy to where you're retaining a significant amount of the dollars that you create, it's practically impossible to get away from what it's like to be an island economy. Alaska is in a precarious state, right? And so our biggest economic base has basically undergone a very significant shock with oil prices going down. And now we need to ask ourselves a question, right? Economies grow in two ways. Jonathan touched on this, Kai touched on this. Either expansion of exports, and we have a few of them, big sectors, really important sectors, or import substitution. Right? You either make more of the things that we sell to the outside, or we keep more of the money. And Alaska, and all three speakers did this, we have an extremely leaky bucket. Right? Everybody would agree on this, right? And typically people just talk about leaky buckets when they talk about rural Alaska. The reality is that the bucket is leaky for the state as a whole, meaning that we generate an extremely high amount of money. I can't remember who it was, but mentioned that the state's GDP is $50 billion. It was $60 billion a few years ago before the decline in oil prices. However, the amount of money that stays in communities in the state is a fraction of that. Right? And so what I would like to talk about is, A, could import substitution work? What are the typical reactions to import substitution? And is it actually mutually exclusive from the expansion of export? And very quickly, in my opinion, it's complementary to the growth of export bases. It's not competitive to export bases. However, it requires a tremendous amount of coordination. Meaning, in this case, and I know some of us have an aversion to government involvement, in this case, there needs to be a clockmaker. There needs to be a clearinghouse. There needs to be a way of coordinating efforts in order to keep more of this money in state. Yes, there are certain efforts. Yes, there are breweries that are making beer in state, and that's fantastic for both drinking and for the economic base. But in order to have a statewide strategy, you have to have government, private sector, and nonprofits all involved, thinking strategically about how to do a better job of plugging some of these leaks. Now, I just want to tell you that I'm a regional economist, And one of the worst things that regional economists did was create an input-output model and start talking about multipliers. Because everybody has a gigantic multiplier, and every sector has a multiplier of 16. If you're up late at night, you hear about every industry creating 17 jobs for every job in the industry. However, when you do research in Alaska, you find one of two things. You find first that the experiences across communities differs vastly, even if they may have the exact same economic base. And the main reason for that is because when you actually open up the lid, what you find is that the supply chains differ drastically, meaning that the things that businesses buy typically are bought from outside of the community, outside of the state, which means that it's really, really hard to actually generate the multiplier that was promised. The second thing, and this is really important, is that when there is a shock to some of those sectors, very rarely do we find that the benefits are actually being retained or enjoyed by the residents of those places. And so I just want to say that when we talk multipliers, we're talking about short-term changes that happen in communities, but what we need to be thinking about is structural changes to communities when a new business enters or when we subsidize a particular industry. The multiplier tells me nothing about the structural change. It simply tells me if I shock this industry or if I add 2 jobs in this industry, this is how much I arguably think will be added in the rest of the economy, which almost never happens, but that's a different story for a different day. So this is a very, very old definition of import substitution. And I can allow that elimination of imports is an exaggeration there, but at least there should be an effort devoted to the reduction, the mitigation of this leakage, right? Because when we think about import substitution, especially in the state of Alaska, what we think about is, well, you know, industry A, we can say fishing, we can say tourism, we can say oil and gas, they're all phenomenal, they're all really big industries, but once you look below the hood and you see how much money leaves the state, it becomes really apparent that those are really great candidates for at least an attempt to retain some of these resources. Now, whenever I talk about this, and I talk about it a lot, the basic objections are some of these, right? Well, no, this is a strategy that's actually used in developing countries and doesn't make any sense here. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have all used very heavy import substitution in order to move themselves into a more industrialized nations. And it's worked for every single one of them. I know that trade liberalization is the way we think about growth, and it's the way of the future. However, most countries, including the US, including England, have gone through periods where they've actually prioritized import substitution. Now, the last bullet is really important because it's true that it's difficult. And I'm not talking about this as though it's a low-hanging fruit, but in my opinion, it's a much lower-hanging fruit than saying that we're going to create a brand new industry and that brand new industry is going to be paying $150,000 for every single worker. Because we already have the industries, we already have the structure. All we need to think about is how to actually make sure that we think about the supply chain and long-term changes as opposed to just immediate shocks to economies and how they reverberate. And this is really important because in my mind, import substitution is a dirty word whenever I talk to people. Why? Because people think protectionism, they think tariffs, and they think developed countries that have grown a lot don't do this. Well, that's really just not true. And at the regional level, there is very little research, there is very little evidence that cities have been aggressive about this. But there are some examples that are really interesting. Cities in Illinois, in Oregon, and in Iowa have devoted very considerable resources to basically do just what I'm describing. Meaning, what they've done is said, you know what, we have these industries, we have these economies, we have a leakage problem, and we're going to try to attack it. And I'll tell you a little bit about what they've done. So that second bullet is exactly what Chicago did a few years ago. Meaning they said, you know what, it's tough to start with private industries. Well, we have fairly large government, and we have fairly large government contracting. What we're going to do is we're going to start actually giving out government contracts based on the percent of goods that the businesses buy from within the city and the share of residents that are actually working in the city. Right? And we do have some form of that. But there was a strategic decision by the city to devote resources to just retaining money within that particular place. And then the last bullet is what I was talking about in terms of needing a clearinghouse or actually needing a concerted effort that requires government, businesses, and nonprofits. Meaning, it's really nice to think that market-driven solutions can result in massive improvements in import substitution, and it's true that they can. But if we're thinking about the next wave, or what Alaska becomes, or what Alaska 2.0 is, in my mind, this needs to be strategic, it needs to be statewide, and we can't have little efforts that are happening in different communities. My last slide is, again, the resistance is, well, this is really not for Alaska, or it's been tried and didn't work. In my mind, you could potentially start with the Chicago model. You could think about what is it that we can do about government contracting, how is it that we can potentially give preferential treatment to local firms, and then expand that idea to the big economic bases. Where are the economic bases in each place? Can we create this clearinghouse or this organization that actually puts businesses together? I guarantee you that I know how hard it is to figure out what people buy, where they buy it, and whether or not those goods are produced locally. I know how hard it is to do that for firms as well. But unless you do it, there is no way to know the extent to which you can make a difference and actually retain more of the money within the state. Thank you so much for your time.